This military policy program was created for Horizon House CCTV, featuring Pete Godston and his book, Navies, Petrol and Chocolate, Why Ukraine Matters, with introduction from Admiral Tom Hayward, longtime resident of Horizon House. The program was produced on June 29th, 2021, for airing on CCTV on June 30th, 2021.
His education, Pete graduated, got his bachelor's degree from highly respected Johns Hopkins University, from which he matriculated and joined the Army in the intelligence branch. And in Korea, there was a big need for intelligence officers, so they quickly marched him off to Korea for a full tour of duty. And following that, it was so good, they took him to the other side of the world, to Germany, where he was an intelligence officer for another tour, and broadened his perspective of the globe and the problems in the Balkans and the Middle East. So we're looking forward to his observations about that. He left the active duty of the Army in about 1987, but joined the reserves. He went off to Harvard and got his MBA. So armed with a lot of life's experiences overseas and the like, and a master's degree from Harvard, he then pursued an active degree in high tech and worked for such companies as Lockheed Martin, Khaki International, Sun Microsystems. But at the same time, he maintained his affiliation with the Army Reserve and the National Guard. So they took advantage of that, and he found himself back in Iraq, leading a battalion-sized task force.
Thanks so much, Admiral. I trust all of you can see the chart here. Those of you here at the Horizon House will recognize the fellow talking to the breaker of the sound barrier there is my dad, Joel Godston. And I hope this presentation will be a credit both to his integrity as a man, a husband, and a father, as well as to the excellence of his work as an engineer, a pilot, and a citizen of these United States. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about why I selected the words Navies, Petrol, and Chocolate for the title of my book. I think that will become pretty clear as we go through the presentation. I am going to talk a little bit about the recent G7 meeting, the meeting between President Biden and President Putin in Geneva, as well as we'll touch on what's going on in Israel. I've organized the talk according to the United States combatant commands. And the reason for that is I find when I comment about helping Ukraine, very frequently informed people respond by raising issues of priority or resourcing. So it makes sense, I think, to put Ukraine in the context of our larger global footprint. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this Department of Defense chart. I did want to mention that my last stint for the Army was at the Defense Intelligence Agency. I was not focused on Ukraine or Russia. Instead, they had me focused on the Afghanistan, Pakistan, and federally administrated tribal areas there. But I minored in Russian at Johns Hopkins and participated in innumerable analyses of Russian or Soviet style forces arrayed in attack formation. So we'll see some of that. The last job that I applied for in the government was in the defense media activity. So I'm going to talk very briefly at the end of the presentation about the Stars and Stripes newspaper and some opportunities I feel are represented there. Primarily, the reason for this chart is, of course, there are no longer 10 unified combatant commands. There are 11 with the addition of the Space Force. And I should add that the Space Force reports to the Secretary of the Air Force. So that's interesting. But we'll talk a little bit about that in the next chart. Here is the array of the combatant commands across the globe. Of course, some of the combatant commands are not geospatially oriented. I'm going to talk about Spacecom only briefly in the next chart. I'm not going to talk about Transcom at all, but we'll touch on all the other ones. So I thought it was interesting that the powers that be selected an Army Air Defender, General Dickinson, to be the Space Force commander. Given that he reports to the Secretary of the Air Force, you might get the idea that his main job is to keep anybody from shooting down any U.S. airplanes. But of course, in space, one of the major assets is our global positioning satellite constellation. And it's fair to say that every single sophisticated system, whether it be on the ground, in the sky, or in the oceans, is dependent on those geopositioning satellites. And any kind of interference with the transmissions coming from those, and certainly any kind of kinetic attack on them, would have a big impact on our forces on the ground. So I promised to talk a little bit about the Group of Seven. Of course, we would love to have seen more activity in that meeting regarding Ukraine. There was some discussion around Mr. Navalny, who's some would say a competitor of Mr. Putin's in Russia, but not a lot of discussion about Ukraine. I did label these three individuals. As you can see, there are more than 7 people standing on the stage here. I thought it was interesting to see 2 from the European Union, and of course the hostess of the event in Cornwall, Queen Elizabeth II. The members of the Group of Seven are, of course, United States, Germany, France, UK, Japan, Italy, and Canada. Not in attendance. So the group, when it first started, was called the Library Group. It was expanded to a group of 8 after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, under the hope that Russia would become a capitalist democracy. Of course, we're less pleased with what's happened with Russia. So Russia was not a participant, nor was China. So why would I mention China as part of an economic meeting? Well, China's economy today is one of the largest in the world, $21 trillion economy. But of course, some of the activity that happened in the G7 meeting was, how do we stand up to some of China's insidious activities across the world? The focus of this particular slide, and let me move my screen here so you can see, I thought it made sense to consider the fragmentation of some of the regions in the world as we think about trying to do business in them. So we're going to look at that by taking a look at currencies. Anybody have any thoughts on how many currencies there are in South and Central America? Hearing none, there are 15 different currencies. Africa, even more challenging. So as you try to do business in some of these places, it's a challenge. But let's get back to China. So China wasn't always a robust economy. In fact, it used to be a pretty poor country. And then 1971 happened. Any thoughts on what happened in 1971?
Richard Nixon went to China.
That's right. Richard Nixon recognized China, the People's Republic of China, and started what became a rather large set of flows between the United States and China. I would say we created this monster, or certainly contributed to it. And now Admiral Aquilino, commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, is chartered with trying to hold the Chinese at bay in the Indo-Pacific region, but we're also seeing them active in Africa and even in Europe. They're making investments in ports and infrastructure and setting up loan agreements which give them control when the payments aren't coming due of those region, of those particular assets. So big challenge. So the pivot to the east would suggest that there's a pivot from happening somewhere. And I think it made sense at this point in the talk to mention that when we pivot away from Europe, we might want to think about what the Russians are doing. And so there are two corridors that people talk about when they talk about coming from Russia to Europe, the Suwalki and the Ukraine avenues. Suwalki Avenue is largely occupied by Belarusia. And of course, the latest news on Belarusia is that President Putin has an extremely close relationship with the leadership of Belarusia, to the degree that Russian troops are invited to be stationed in Belarusia, in fact, on the border of Poland. So Vladimir Putin doesn't really need to do anything to move into Belarusia. He's got a close ally. Ukraine is not in a similar situation. Under the Trump administration, we did provide anti-tank weapons. That was a good news story. That's really the first substantive thing we did to help protect Ukraine from the military incursions that they're seeing from Russia. The problem with anti-tank missiles is that the latest Russian tank, the T-14, has a very effective system for deflecting anti-tank missiles. Now, they haven't upgraded all of their tanks to T-14s, but certainly we would expect to see those tanks probably where most of those anti-tank missiles might be positioned. So I'm also not going to spend a lot of time talking about the recent Kerch Strait incident, but I think what we see consistently from Russia is not an interest in building economies, but in controlling neighbors, and in some cases doing so in pretty violent fashion. So let's talk a little bit about Ukraine, because one of the first objections I hear when I talk, again, to inform people, first of all, they say, well, gosh, Ukraine is to Russia like Texas is to the United States. And so I think it makes sense to understand a little bit of the history of Ukraine. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history here through some videos. But before I get to those videos, I want to point out that the Verkhovna Rada, Ukraine's unicameral legislature, has been in place since 900 AD. So there is roots of democracy in Ukraine, and has been since really even before the Moscow presence became prominent. Another comment that people make is that, well, Russia really needs a warm water port in Crimea. That's why the Crimean War was fought by Peter the Great's wife and successor, Catherine the Great. But in fact, there's a problem with the Sevastopol naval base in Crimea. And that problem is the Dardanelles Strait, which is controlled by Turkey, and basically provides a bottleneck to any naval vessels in the Black Sea region. So if you need a blue water navy, having that stuck in Crimea is not the best deal. Then the other comment people make is, well, you know, the West doesn't owe Ukraine anything. And on that front, we perhaps forget that when the Soviet Union dissolved, the non-proliferation interests suggested that Ukraine should give about a third of the Soviet arsenal to the Russians. So the Russians would have it all, one less actor that's nuclear capable. And in exchange for Ukraine's willingness to give those nuclear weapons to Russia, we agreed to protect them from any kind of incursion, any kind of violent attack. So while I wouldn't say that in the international realm promises are always kept, I would say that it isn't true to say we don't owe Ukraine anything. We, NATO, the West, promised Ukraine protection when they gave up those nuclear weapons. So at this point, I want to go to the history. I'm going to show some videos here, and we'll kind of illustrate what happened. The first video, oops, is creeping over to the wrong place here. The first video talks about the Mongols. So in roughly 1200 AD, the Mongols swept toward Europe, and like Alexander the Great before them, the Mongols usually, if you surrendered, were more than happy to let your existing government administer their taxes, administer their rule. However, the Ukrainian Cossacks were not ones to just roll over. And in violation of the modern rule of war, unity of command, one of the Ukraine princes chased after a Mongol Rus. And let's watch this clip. So that Russian prince, having separated from the other 2/3 of the Cossacks, was soundly defeated. He retreated back to a fort where the Mongols put them under siege. After some period of time, the Cossacks decided to surrender on the promise that they would be allowed to return to their lands. And having heard stories about how generous the Mongols had been, they went ahead and laid down their arms. But of course, because they resisted, the Mongols, instead of releasing them, massacred everyone, men, women, and children. So the first of the tragedies for the Ukraine nation was inflicted by the Mongols. Then that was in roughly 1200 AD. 500 years later, Peter the Great decided that he was going to change the status of certain very important things to what was then called a hetmanate. Ivan Mazepa had successfully united the right and the left banks of the Dnieper River to be the Kiev nation and what has become modern Ukraine. But Peter the Great decided not only was he going to relocate the Kievan Russian Orthodox Patriarch to Moscow, he was going to remove the special privileges that the Cossacks had in the Tsar court. So realizing the situation was going sideways for him, Ivan Mazepa allied with the Swedish king, Charles XII. Now at the time, the Swedes were a major power in Europe, and they had been waging a war for some time with Peter the Great. Unfortunately, they decided to meet Peter the Great at Poltava. And here's a clip that shows Peter the Great giving his troops a pep talk.
Непобедимого, то ложь, которую вы победами своими неоднократно доказывали. О Петре ведайте, что ему жизнь его недорога. Лишь пожила Россия во славе и благополучии для благосостояния вашего.
So pretty good pep talk, although I suspect most of us don't understand the Russian words that Peter the Great was shouting there. The gentleman that's laying on this litter here is Charles XII, or at least a representation of him. Unfortunately for the efforts of the hetman, Ivan Mazepa, his Cossacks, and the Swedes that were gathered that day, the day before, Charles XII was wounded, and he had pretty much been considered almost immortal by his troops, almost like Achilles. tremendously successful. Unfortunately, without his leadership, his cavalry got lost in the dark. They did not execute the battle plan as outlined, and they were soundly defeated. Tens of thousands of lives were lost. And in fact, Peter the Great memorialized all of those lost, as well as those of his own troops, with the memorial chapel that you'll see behind me on my behind my image here in this presentation. So the next discussion we typically want to cover is what happened when the Soviets took over. So as we all know, the Russian Empire fell, the Reds consolidated power, and in the 1930s then branched out to the country of Ukraine. Ukraine had been the breadbasket of the Russias. Large farming farms traded grain, various foodstuffs, not only with Russia, but around Europe. And then suddenly, when the Reds came into Ukraine, the observation was made that this class of farmer, the kulaks, looked an awful bourgeois. So they were either killed or sent off to Siberia. The unfortunate happenstance then was the productivity of the Russian black soil fell precipitously, but the Soviets didn't stop demanding foodstuffs to feed Moscow and other Russian cities. Instead, they took the foodstuffs and left folks to starve in Ukraine.
A starving child slumped on a staircase and ignored by passers-by in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. These images of desperation and death were taken during one of the darkest periods in Ukraine's history, the man-made famine of the early 1930s, known as the Holodomor.
These people were crawling on their hands and knees, begging for help.
Samara Pierce's great-grandfather, Alexander Wienerberger, secretly shot these photos.
This is the gentleman he watched die for 4 days.
Wienerberger was an Austrian engineer taken prisoner by Russia in World War I who stayed in the country, eventually helping the Soviet Union set up chemical plants.
So 2 million Ukrainians died in the Holodomor. And I guess my question for everyone is this, do we really want to put Ukraine back in the hands of the Russians who inflicted this kind of damage? The last clip we'll show at this stage of the talk is that when the time came to try and reinvigorate the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to allow more decentralized decision-making. He set up something called the Combined Independent States and really was hoping to build another version of the Soviet Union. However, a gentleman by the name of Boris Yeltsin came into conflict with Gorbachev. Gorbachev fired him, but Yeltsin was a pretty resourceful politician, pretty savvy, managed to get himself elected as the mayor of Moscow and then as the president of Russia. And then when the timing was right, he managed to go off and set up an alliance with Belarus and another of the Eastern European countries, and essentially walk away from Mikhail Gorbachev. So the point here is that without a strong Ukraine, the Russian situation that we see today would not have evolved.
On December the 8th, 1991, we wrote and signed a 2-page agreement on the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States and managed to provide a peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Empire.
Gennady Burbulis was one of just 6 men who sealed the fate of the Soviet Union in less than 24 hours. It was a tough year for Soviet politics. President of the USSR Mikhail Gorbachev barely survived an attempted coup d'etat. President of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, was openly contesting Gorbachev's power. Meanwhile, the country was effectively bankrupt, with shops empty and the people restless.
So let's go back to the PowerPoint charts at this point. I mentioned navies being an important point that people make about Crimea and the reason for Russia's interest in Ukraine and taking back pieces of Ukraine. And I typically observe, because of the Dardanelles Strait, that the port city of Tartus, which Russia has access to, is perhaps one of the more important warm water ports. And it would seem that this fact escaped policymakers back when we went into Syria. We allied with the Russians under the assumption that their interest in fighting terrorists. As it turns out, they were interested in fighting terrorists that might be undermining Bashar Assad. Their objective in Syria was to keep Bashar Assad in power so they could maintain their port in Tartus. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the proposed safe zone. I know there was a bit of a discussion about the Kurds when Donald Trump decided to pull out of Syria. At this point, Kurdistan is still a challenge for those in Kurdistan and along the border of Turkey and Iraq. And perhaps what we're seeing from the current administration as we now examine pulling out of Afghanistan is that we're taking care of the people that helped us to make sure that they're not persecuted by the Taliban as the Taliban takes over. So I mentioned the terrorist activity that's going on. There, of course, is a global presence of terrorists that we're worried about. ISIS is one of the main players there, and the United States has a Special Operations Command to address these this global presence. Of course, the focus of our fight against terror has been in Afghanistan, about $9 billion since 2001, and that number, by the way, was something that came from several years ago, so the number's a lot larger now. CENTCOM is really the main game in town in the United States Department of Defense in terms of resources, and I spent a year in Iraq working for a guy that became a two-star general responsible for the Army's Intelligence Center and School, Bob Ashley, and then he was invited to be the G2 of the Army, a three-star position after that. And his last stint with the Army as a three-star again was to head up the Defense Intelligence Agency. I promised to make a comment about Israel, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about a lot of the activity there. I did want to throw up this chart. The Palestinian problem is not a small one. There are a lot of Palestinian folks there. I would say, though, that two of the most dangerous terrorists organizations, I don't know who's trying to call me, but I'm going to hang up again, Mom. Sorry. Two of the most dangerous terrorist organizations in the world, Hamas and Hezbollah, support the Palestinian cause, are supported in turn by Iran, and are a big challenge. The decision was made by the Biden administration to shift the responsibility of Israel from the European Command to the Central Command, presumably given the decision to pull out of Afghanistan. So General McKenzie will have a little more resources available to him and presumably some mind space to deal with yet another challenge when he's not up to his elbows in Afghanistan. I put the image of Alfred Nobel here because I heard several weeks ago that if he's able to address the Palestinian issue effectively, President Biden might end up being an awardee on of the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm not sure how many United States presidents have won a Nobel Peace Prize based on helping calm the region down a bit, but who knows? I wanted to talk a little bit about chocolate as we dive into the African continent, and primarily the point of this chart is to really call out what a small percentage of profits actually accrue to the folks who harvest the cocoa beans. Now, in a capitalist organization, we don't typically try to figure out ways we can pay our suppliers more. But I think in this situation, it certainly helps us to make sure the folks that live where we're trying to help are able to make a decent living. So we got somebody else coming in, and there you are. 70% of the world's cocoa beans come from 4 West African countries. So the fact that very young labor is being used to harvest some of these crops is absolutely a challenge for the African continent, and something we should be paying attention to as we try to improve things for our brothers and sisters there. I would be remiss not to point out that there's also petrol in Africa, primarily Nigeria has a rather large body of proven oil reserves. AFRICOM has an enduring footprint, so those are areas that we are presumably not planning to leave, as well as a non-enduring footprint, which presumably are areas where we're already planning on withdrawing. But let's get back to Russia. Russia has proven to be very aggressive recently, continues to be aggressive. I mentioned seized Crimea with Russian troops for the port in Sevastopol, also grabbed the region of Donbass, which is in this area here. I think everyone can see that green arrow that I've got. Some strong mineral resources happening in Donbass, as well as some petrol processing facilities, as well as manufacturing. But Ukraine isn't the only place that's suffered from Russian aggression. In Georgia, South Ossetia has also been seized by Russian interests, and Russia maintains control with what they're doing there. And then in Azerbaijan, the Nagorno-Karabakh area has also been seized by the Russians. So at this point, Russia has been very successful in controlling various parts of Eastern Europe. The question is, why would they go beyond where they've already been? Hearkening back to the chart that I first showed, Ukraine is in the way of Russian expansion into Romania, into Bulgaria, and some of the other parts of Eastern Europe. Other examples of a Russian threat are the cyber information warfare and hacking activities that have been underway. So, of course, we are all aware that it appears Russian hackers penetrated the Democratic National Committee email system and then shared some of that data to the major party alternative. Russians have been active in the cyber arena in all of these other attacks, in particular Georgia, lots of activity. And then the recent pipeline attack here in the United States, Colonial Pipeline, was not a Russian state attack, but a Russian-based group of hackers deposited ransomware on Colonial Pipeline systems, resulting in a real challenge for the United States, at least for a number of days. And a case in point that Russian capability is non-trivial across the cyber domain. Before I move away from this chart, I did want to mention the economic narrative that Vladimir Putin likes to emphasize whenever he travels across the globe. And this harkens back to the challenge that we face in Africa with cocoa beans and in other places where there is oil wealth. Putin likes to talk about how capitalist countries take advantage, and this is an area that we can't just walk away from. We need to be aware that people need to be treated fairly in some of these places, or we're playing right into Russia's messaging. Not a good situation. This is my favorite chart of the whole bunch, because it's been the focus of the last 4 years of my life, and that is the propagation of cloud and technology in the healthcare arena. So under the Obama administration, electronic health record systems became a legislated mandate. Large organizations have spent hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars, setting these systems in place. Productivity does not necessarily go through the roof once those are developed, but the benefits that we gain from automating our health systems are laid out in this chart. The challenge, of course, becomes when that digital infrastructure, it can be penetrated. And how do we respond to that? Well, General Nakasone is not the complete solution. In fact, every organization needs to do its job in terms of cybersecurity, applying patches as systems are upgrading, making sure that systems manage access the way they're supposed to, managing their configuration so people can't easily penetrate to gather information that they're not supposed to have. And it's also important to understand where vulnerabilities are, not only with the electronic health record system itself, but also with the underlying technologies that, for example, we saw with the Colonial Pipeline challenge. The other observation that folks from Cerner who sketched this particular diagram would suggest is it's important that leadership has visibility to the threat and that we work hard to understand the threat. There's a technology out there called blockchain, which is particularly useful for tracking pharmaceutical batch propagation, and is also helpful in laying out resources, getting those resources down to minute parts of the value chain. And then I'm very excited to see the security mechanisms that Amazon Web Services and other cloud providers are delivering, which help us make the world a lot more secure of a place. At this point, we are about 10 minutes from the end. I think we can, John, I don't know if we have any questions or whether there was another reason for the call that came in. Maybe one of you was trying to reach me. Are there any questions pending right now before I go to the next chart? I'll move to the next chart.
I have not received any questions yet, Pete.
Okay, great. So I mentioned the combatant commands. Of course, we spend a lot of time as we read the news concerned about the nuclear threat from Iran, the nuclear threat from North Korea, and of course, Russian and Chinese threats. Admiral Richard is responsible for paying attention to those threats, and then looking at our own airspace. The NORTHCOM commander, General Van Herk, is responsible for keeping us safe here in America. We got some strong leadership and some robust organizations keeping us safe. But again, back to Ukraine. So we've walked through now much of the resources that the United States has across the globe. Let's go back to the Ukraine democracy and talk about why we should invest in Ukraine, because I think there's been improvement in the country. And I'm going to first mention that in the last presidential election, there was a credible woman running. Yulia Tymoshenko, former prime minister, was one of the candidates. The incumbent of the country, the President Poroshenko, was the other candidate. And the ultimate winner was Volodymyr Zelensky. Without further ado, I think I want to show you a couple more videos to give you a sense for Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky. His credentials to work as the president of Ukraine were, in fact, that he played one on TV.
Значит так, закон один для всех. А иначе, пожалуйста, чемоданы в руки, большой привет.
Вы что, нам угрожаете?
Но я сделаю все, чтобы эти законы были приняты.
Смешно.
Что, ты действительно его выпустишь?
Выпущу одного, посажу всех.
Ты долбанулся, что ли?
С олигархами нужно поступать точно так же. Столкнуть их лбами, развалить коалицию и договориться с каждым по отдельности.
Полностью переделали ему внешность, его мама родная не...
So that is Volodymyr Zelensky. And his well-intended presidency on TV ended up getting him the popularity he needed to win the election, and he won it quite decisively. And let me get this out of the way so I can show you the next video.
28 великих, могучих, независимых государств.
Я не понял, что произошло.
Вам знакома теория Большого взрыва? Все концентрировалось, сжималось, давление увеличилось, напряжение росло, температура зашкаливала, и бах! И на молекулы. Перед вами территория полураспада в хаотичном движении.
То есть Украины больше нет?
Почему же нет? Есть. Где она? А вот, легитимная Украина, правда, без Троещины.
Как?
Королевство Троещина, наше отечественное Монако. Потом та самая Украина, первая Украина, великая Украина. Была одна, стала 4. Любой вкус и цвет.
Шведская волость.
Шведская волость. Бывшая Полтавская область. Областная рада пересмотрела результаты Полтавской битвы и присудила победу шведам.
В смысле, 300 лет спустя?
Ну, историческую справедливость восстановить никогда не поздно, Василий Петрович.
А что Швеция?
The Swedes, by the way, were silent in response. The Sea Breeze 2021 military exercise involves NATO. Russia's complained about that. The other exercise that's pending is Zapad 2021, which is a Russian exercise scheduled for the October timeframe. What's interesting about that particular exercise is that Russia has 1 million active military compared to Ukraine's 250,000. Russia also has 2 million reserves forces, and they've been transitioning various brigades to a division infrastructure. So what that means is they've redesignated, for example, the 26th Infantry Brigade into the 26th Infantry Division, and they've formed other brigades to flesh out that division, and they're staffing them with the reserves, which means that they can rapidly move a much larger number of folks into a particular region. The typology of armed conflict that the Russians typically think about is a local war, a regional war, and the large-scale war. Large-scale war would typically result in a complete mobilization It will be very interesting to see as we watch the Russians ramp up for Zapad 2021, if they're fully mobilizing or if we're seeing something maybe more regional. So my recommendation in my book is that we put some boots on the ground in Ukraine to keep the Russians from attacking, similar to the presence that the Second Armored Cavalry had when I was in West Germany back in the late 80s. So here's a map that shows the recommendation not only of Second Armored Cavalry Regiment, but also a National Guard Brigade. A-10s tend to discourage any kind of an armed incursion into a country. Quite an impressive anti-tank weapon. With A-10s in Ukraine, one would imagine Russia probably won't be sending armored columns into the country. F-16s also are very good ground air support weapon. F-15s really more of an air defender or part of air superiority. In my book, a novel, Ukraine Skies, Baltimore Lights, I talk about an investment banker ramping up some of the Ukraine precision manufacturing to be able to provide parts both for any kind of a ground presence as well as aircraft in the country, which presumably bolsters Ukraine's economy and also could reduce any kind of a cost that we might experience by helping in this way.
The novel, Ukraine Skies, Baltimore Lights, is available in softcover and ebook from Amazon.com, while the audio version is available from your favorite provider.
But let's go back to the question of navies. This is in red, the Ukraine country. This is a blow up of Crimea specifically and the territorial seas that Russia has claimed after occupying Crimea. Now this becomes interesting when you start to consider the deep water oil reserves that are off the coast of Crimea. Ukraine is not heavily dependent on oil, which you can see from this chart. So perhaps less than the rest of the world, only a sliver of dependence on oil compared to coal, for example. But Ukraine does have the capability of shipping petrol and related products to Europe, which presumably wouldn't be something that Vladimir Putin would be very excited about. The Skifsk region here in blue has the deep water deposits that I mentioned a moment ago. And prior to Russian occupation of Crimea, there were a number of oil companies in discussions with Ukraine to develop that those deep water oil reserves. Developing deep water oil reserves is non-trivial. So working with some of the other established oil companies would be critical for Ukraine's success on that point. So the point here is that protecting some of the resources that might be drilling to shore up Ukraine, the oil industry and economy would be important. I would be remiss, though, when pointing out that there is an oil economy opportunity here, that folks like Greta Thunberg and others would say that we should stop developing oil resources immediately. I would go so far as to say that we're seeing the oil industry, transportation industries, all working hard to reduce carbon footprint. But I think the world is going to continue to see activity with carbon resources for some time into the future. And I think Ukraine benefits significantly by being able to deliver these resources, and won't be able to do so without help from the United States and NATO. So what are the
Pete, I do
policies?
have one question now.
Okay.
And this is from Mr. Hall, who says, doesn't the Biden presidency embolden both Russia's and China's expansion objectives? Maybe you'd like to comment on that.
Well, I would say the answer to that is yes, although I'm sure President Biden and his advisors would disagree. Certainly, I think President Biden feels that he has sent a strong message to Vladimir Putin, but we haven't seen dramatic activity to support any kind of standing up to Russian interests. And certainly on the China front, the discussion at the G7 about standing up to China economically hasn't really come into fruition yet. So there's more to be done. And I think helping Ukraine is a strong step in standing up to Russian aggression moving forward. I did want to mention on this chart, and I know we're now after 5 o'clock, Ukraine has 5 refineries already in the country, but 4 of them are so outdated that they can only be used for oil storage. And one of them does not have the technology capable of producing gasoline that can even be sold to Europe. Only one has that capability. So there would need to be investments in Ukraine to upgrade its refineries, even if it were able to drill for some of that deep water oil that I mentioned. And then again, the question about protecting offshore oil rigs and finding help to open markets in Europe. I wanted to mention the Southern Command. I think I promised that I would do that. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the numbers here, although what we have seen recently is a lot more people coming north. I think the question that I ask as a defense policy person is, aren't there ways that we can make some of those countries more habitable for people so they don't feel so compelled to come to the United States? The impeachment, I know when people talk about Ukraine, there's typically a lot of discussion about that. And I also don't want to throw a lot of rocks other directions. What I will say, though, is one of the big objections investors raise when people talk about investing in Ukraine is corruption. The last thing as an investor that you want to see is for some oligarch to snatch not only most of the profits from the business you invested in, but in fact, even the principal. So that is a real problem, has been a real problem. And I would say Mr. Zelensky is attempting to address that. Of course, it doesn't help with that reputation when children of US politicians are also getting similarly involved, but nowhere near, frankly, as egregiously involved in that kind of a situation as some of the oligarchs coming out of Russia or Ukraine. So again, Mr. Zelensky is working very hard to address that issue, and how successful he is with that will determine how successful he is moving forward in staying elected. Right now, he's got a majority in the Verkhovna Rada, so good news for him. The other point I'd make is right now, you can see when Russia occupied Crimea and the Donbass, Ukraine's economy, the GNP dropped precipitously. We're now back to 500 million, which is in fact was better than it was before the Russians occupied. I would argue, based on some of the opportunities we've talked about in this presentation, that Ukraine could have $1 trillion economy. Lots of opportunity. I promised to talk about the Stars and Stripes. All I'm going to say about that is that in a world of information is free, in a world where the Washington Post is no longer hiring as many reporters to send around the world, New York Times, any major newspaper, perhaps the Defense Department's Stars and Stripes could work harder to cover a larger geographic scope, and also perhaps improve on the kind of reporting that it does, so that some of its stories get picked up by the United Press. And without further ado, I'm going to just ask the question, can resources from the United States make a better world? Can we be back in the years of the John F. Kennedy, where we can support any friend and oppose any foe? You know, we're not in the same economic position we were back in those days, but we would like to believe that there are things to be done. The Department of State, in fact, has the Charter for Understanding the World. In the words of a SEAL who was once asked by someone, hey, do they teach you how to speak foreign languages when you join the Navy SEALs? He said, they don't pay me to talk when I go places. So in many cases, the Defense Department doesn't go to talk, but there is a lot that we can do in terms of understanding the world in which we operate to make a difference.
With that expanded scope, Pete, I do have another audience question.
Okay, great.
Once we pull out of Afghanistan, will Russia have an interest in returning?
You know, that's my own personal opinion is I don't think so. I don't think they got a lot out of that presence in Afghanistan. And I think the last thing the Russians want to do is get tangled up in the mess of a Taliban again. But I would imagine if you're getting ready to walk away from there, you might be talking to folks who are worried about a presence. So I did want to mention that you can get copies of Navies, Petrol and Chocolate, Why Ukraine Matters at Amazon, but it's a lot more expensive than $25. So my mom, Anne Marie Godston, has in apartment 4M, has a number of copies. If you'd like a copy for $25, either send her cash or a check. Let us know what you want inscribed. And if there's anyone here from the East Coast or otherwise not part of the Horizon House community, you can send me $25 on PayPal. My PayPal handle is godston@aol.com. We'll cover the postage. Just provide us with what your address is and a preferred inscription, and we'll get a copy over to you for that price. And at this point, I'm done with the prepared remarks.
Yeah, I think about that point, Pete. We run out of our assigned time, but I'm sure you're ready to stand by for more questions if there are some. But I want to make sure that we acknowledge our appreciation to you for this effort and this broad scope that you have covered in many, many different topics. Somehow we'll have to try to rectify whatever damage was done by the link, but we do have the word out here with respect to this being shown tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, Admiral, I would say, you know, I'm delighted that we got the turnout we got, and I'm more than happy to stay for another 10 or 15 or 20 minutes to answer any questions if there are any. But thank you, folks, for joining the Zoom call, and we're going to air this call on the CCTV tomorrow. So it will be exactly this particular transmission that you'll see if you were to choose to dial in for that.
So thank you very, very much from all of us.
Any other questions?
I do not have any in the chat.
I probably should ask Ina to talk about Lithuania since we have a few minutes.
The current situation is that they are truly concerned about the fact that Putin is making these overtures on his borders, and Lithuania is very much on its border, particularly with Kaliningrad actually having a border, and the fact that the gas line is going through the Baltic Sea, which is again something that this is, you know, natural gas going from Russia to Europe. And will this be an environmental problem possibly, or also a control over Europe and Lithuania. And in whatever way it would be affected if Russia decides to really return those three Baltic countries into the Russian orbit. So Lithuania is very interested in maintaining NATO strength in Europe because that's their only way of surviving should Putin, I should say, become in any way power hungry.
That's all the questions that I see, Pete.
Okay. So I guess
Thank you very much.
without further ado, thank you, sir.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of you for this wonderful opportunity to share a few thoughts, and I hope it was helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pete.
Thank you.
We thank Anna Marie for helping out, keeping us up on it.
Yeah.
Good.
This military policy program was created for Horizon House CCTV, featuring Pete Godston and his book, Navies, Petrol and Chocolate, Why Ukraine Matters. The program was produced on June 29th for airing on CCTV on June 30th, 2021. Thanks for watching.